Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Last week, against my own better judgment, I picked up a new Analogue Pocket. They were releasing limited edition ones, and I just really couldn't resist this color, even though I already own one of these. And since it's been a couple years since my last video about the Analogue Pocket, I figure it was time for an update to just talk about, the state of this device right now. So in this video, I want to talk about this new model and any changes that I've seen at a hardware level compared to the one that I bought a few years back. And finally, I want to talk about some accessories and software updates and what it's like to actually own one of these right now and whether or not it's worth that pretty hefty asking price. Either way, if you ever thought about picking up an Analogue Pocket, or maybe you just want to make sure you're getting the most out of it, I'm hoping this video will be pretty helpful for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start all the way at the beginning and talk about what the Analogue Pocket really is. Now, this is the first FPGA handheld. FPGA stands for Field Programmable Gate Array. And in the most basic sense, an FPGA is basically a type of integrated circuit that can be configured. And what this means when it comes to a gaming console is that it can be programmed at the circuit level. There's a lot of disagreement about how to really articulate this, and honestly, I'm not an expert, so I really couldn't do it myself. But the way I personally think about it is that an FPGA is more like hardware emulation. It's going to be emulating the original hardware environment. Meanwhile, software emulation, which I generally cover on this channel, is a little bit different. In that case, we're taking a standardized chip like a CPU and then trying to run software on it, which will allow us to play those games. So whether or not FPGA is emulation or not is up for debate. In fact, Analogue themselves say it's not. But when it comes down to it, when playing a game via FPGA like on the Analogue Pocket, the experience in general is going to be closer to the original hardware than it will be with software emulation. This means that you will often get increased accuracy when it comes to both sound and graphics, and all the other flaws that you can expect from original hardware like slowdown and whatnot will also happen here. And then finally, one of the more important aspects is that input latency is generally going to be less than it will be on other handhelds. Now, a couple of the main tech specs about the Analogue Pocket include the screen as well as the battery. The screen is 3.5 inches with a 10:9 aspect ratio, much like the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. However, it has a much higher resolution, 1600 by 1440p, which is a perfect 10x integer scale of those two systems. In addition, we've got a pretty big battery, 4300 mAh, which usually gives me around 6 to 8 hours of gameplay. Now, all these features, including this brilliant screen as well as the hardware inside, do come at a cost. In the standard Analogue Pocket sells for $220 before taxes and shipping. Now, even though the Analogue Pocket came out back in 2022, it's been out of stock most of the time. Thankfully, as of making this video, the two standard colors, both black and white, are still available and up for sale. Additionally, over the past year or so, they've released a bunch of what they call highly limited quantities of limited editions. They've had a couple transparent models and then even some $500 metal models. And then most recently, they had the Game Boy Color line, which is the one that I picked up. Now, these were selling for $250, so a little bit more than the standard price, but I really like that yellow color, so I picked it up. And even though many of these will sell out very quickly, I was surprised to find that even several days later, some were still available. In fact, even right now, the gold model is still up for sale. Now, my buying experience from Analogue this time around was actually a surprisingly pleasant experience. First of all, they have actually reduced their shipping prices. So previously it used to be $60 to ship anything from Analogue, which is located in Oregon, just across the ocean to Hawaii. However, they have now reduced that price down to $30, and I think that that's still a little bit high to go from one state to the next, but I'll take it. Secondly, my device shipped super fast. In fact, I had it within 5 days of making my purchase. So it does feel, at least this time around, that some of their supply and shipping issues have been improved. Okay, considering the fact that I spent nearly $300 for a new Game Boy, I think it is worth doing just a full unboxing, so I have not seen this device at all before. Looking at the box, it's very similar to what I remember when I first got my other Analogue Pocket, although of course it now says the Dandelion Limited Edition. So let's take a look inside the box, and oh, holy smokes. I really do like this color. I'm not sure if it's coming up just perfectly here in the video, but this is kind of a red tinge to the overall yellow color, and I really like it. It reminds me a lot of the original Retroid Pocket 2 that I bought back in 2020. So yes, I do think that I picked the right color scheme, all things considered. Let's go ahead and pull out the device. And so we've got a little bit of like plastic covering right here, but otherwise, we've got a little screen protector and everything else is just kind of naked and empty. Also inside the box, we've got a little charging cable. Let's take a look inside. And so this is a USB-C to USB-C cable, and it does have some analog branding on it. We've also got a little packet inside, and this came with an FPGA sticker, an analog logo, and then also a quick start QR code. And then also on the back, it shows you how to get up and running. Okay, looking at the device itself, yeah, it's very familiar to the one that I've been owning for years now. Other than obviously the color difference, everything seems to be the same. It is a little bit unique to have something just so bright and bold compared to the more subdued look I have with the white model. If you look at the difference between the two, I still do feel like this one is a lot cleaner looking overall, but man, I like how this one pops as well. Let's do a little bit of hardware testing just from scratch here, and I'm going to focus on the D-pad and face buttons, mostly because that's what you're going to be playing the most. Now this D-pad is a rubber membrane connection, and so it's got a pretty good amount of travel and pivot to it. I've always liked this D-pad, although on my white model it feels a little bit loose. For example, you can see here that I can kind of easily move the D-pad around. It's not a big deal. I still find this to be just fine while actually in a game, but it does feel like this one's a little bit tighter. It doesn't move around as much, and this may just be because it's brand new versus something that's a couple years old, but all the same, I think this actually feels pretty great. It definitely has a clean kind of feel to it. There's no bumps or anything else on the D-pad, so it doesn't really remind me of something like an NES or Super Nintendo controller. Instead, it feels a lot more modern. It's a similar story with these face buttons. They also feel nice and tight, rubber membrane connection, although you can also see that there is a difference in the design between the two. The two buttons on the left are slightly concave, whereas the other ones on the right side are not. They feel more flat. And it does help to differentiate between the two, and I think these buttons feel good. Again, they're a little bit tighter than I was expecting, especially compared to my older one, but I think the key factor here is just the fact that it's brand new. Either way, in terms of just using the D-pad and face buttons, yeah, I've got no complaints here overall. Now looking at the rest of the front, we've got a little FPGA logo right here. I think it's a really nice touch, and it really pops on this yellow color. And then we have our select and start buttons, and then our analog menu button. These ones have a slight micro switchy feel to them, but you know, you're not going to be pressing them very often, so I don't really have any issues either way with these. Now, even though the bezels are the same size as the one on the white model, you can see that because it's black, it just kind of fades into the device itself. But those large bezels will be a lot more apparent when you have the device actually turned on. The only other thing worth noting here on the front is that we have a little Analogue Pocket logo embedded into the bezel. Now let's take a look at the back. I've always liked the feel of the back on the Analogue Pocket. It is slightly rounded, as you can see here. In fact, it's one of those things where I wish it was slightly rounded on the front as well, because most of the discomfort that comes from playing this device has nothing to do with the back, but rather the front, because we have this little sharp angle. And so even though I do think this is a very premium and modern feeling product, I wish that we didn't have such a sharp edge right here on the front. But when it comes to the back, I think this is one of the best when it comes to a vertical handheld. I like the fact that it lays flat, and it's got a kind of brick feeling to it, but it is rounded enough to be comfortable as well. I also like the subtle textured ribbing that we have here, and then also that analog logo. Now further up, we've got our game cartridge slot. This is going to work for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. You can also use other cartridges with it, but you will need an adapter, and unfortunately I do not have that. Now, one of the major issues that people have with this cartridge slot is when using Game Boy and Game Boy Colors. Essentially, when you pop it in, often if you're playing it and you just push it one way or the other, it's going to disconnect from the game and you're going to lose all your progress. And I will say that just the amount of force that's required to push it out seems to be about the same between the two, so I would not consider this to be a fixed problem. Now, to be honest, I rarely play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games directly in a cartridge on this device, and that's because there's so many different ways you can play it via the SD card. You can either use Game Boy Studio files, so you convert them over to those files instead, and that works really well, or you can use some of the FPGA cores that they have already. So personally, what I do is I have this little 3D printed thing that I bought. I'll try to find the source of this, and I'll leave it linked down below, but it's been years. But essentially what I do is I just put this inside, and so I can cover everything up. That way the cartridge reader is not exposed, but it's not taking up any additional space. Long story short, if you do want to play your original games on this device, it's going to work fine, but you have to be a little bit careful when you're using the left and right shoulder buttons. Considering the fact that you're not going to be using these buttons when playing these games anyway, you can kind of just hold it like this instead of putting your fingers up above, which I think will probably help. And honestly, holding the device like this, where you're not putting your fingers up above, kind of feels more comfortable to me than actually putting them up here. Now, when it comes to Game Boy Advance cartridges, I think it's a lot easier because it's a lot sturdier in the case like this, and so there's less likelihood of it actually being pushed out. So I know that's another thing people have been doing, is they just put a Game Boy Advance cartridge in here and they just leave it in because it's not that intrusive. In fact, some people just buy really cheap Game Boy Advance cartridges or just these shells themselves, and then they cut it right here and then they plop it in, and that way it fits nicely. Let's take a look at the rest of the I/O. So on the left side here, we have one of our two stereo speakers, then we have volume up and down, and then our power button. This will also function as a sleep button depending on the core that you're using. It's not going to work with everything, but many cores will support it. On the right side, we have our other stereo speaker and then our SD card slot. Finally, on the bottom, we have our Game Boy Link cable, and yes, this does work, and then also our USB-C port. We've also got a couple LED indicator lights, but honestly, I just never see these, and so I even forgot that they existed on here. And finally, we have a 3.5mm headphone jack. Now let's talk about the left and right shoulder buttons, and these work just fine, but I will mention that they don't have a lot of travel to them, so they feel kind of mushy in practice. I've never had an issue actually pressing them down. I think they work just fine, but it isn't as satisfying as some of the other buttons in general. But I think one of the most important things is that they are relatively silent, and so I like the fact that they're pretty quiet. Anyway, that's just a quick look at the hardware and unboxing experience. I think that there's been no major change between the original Analogue Pocket that I got several years back and the new one that we have here today. Okay, so next let's just talk about the out-of-box experience when it comes to the software. So I'm not going to do any sort of update, I'm just going to turn the device on. And first and foremost, it's going to walk you through a tutorial, basically telling you which buttons do what. I think you'll probably be able to figure that out. Now, after going through and acknowledging their end user license agreement, you will then be greeted with a QR code to be able to upgrade your software. And we'll do that in a minute, but first I want to just see what it's like out of the box. And honestly, if you're just going to be treating this like an offline device, this is basically all you need. So you can just plug in your cartridge and then start it right up. I'm going to test with a bunch of different cartridges. Some of these I picked up in Japan earlier this year because they're a lot cheaper than the US versions. Either way, as you can see, yeah, I'm playing Game Boy Advance here, no problem whatsoever. But if you press the menu button while in a game and try to go through the settings, you will find that there's not a lot of things that you can do. And that's because if we go into the settings and look at the Analogue OS, it's actually from their January 2022 build, when the device first released. So it does appear that no matter what type of hardware you order from these folks, it's just going to come with the stock firmware from back in 2022. Thankfully, upgrading your firmware is super easy. Just go to the Analogue Pocket website, there's a download link, and from there you can just grab the latest version of the Analogue Pocket firmware, and it was just released a couple weeks back. After that, just take that file and put it in the root of a microSD card, and then put that microSD card in your Analogue Pocket. And when you boot up that handheld, it is going to start that update. I'm going to fast forward it here, but it did take about 2 or 3 minutes altogether. And after that, it will walk you through the tutorial all over again. Now, there are a lot of new changes with this update, but I'm just going to focus on the ones that I've been using the most. So let's start with the cartridge experience itself, because this has been upgraded quite a bit. And the most important factor for me is what they call memories. This was implemented later, but it's essentially their save states. And when it comes to playing on a cartridge, this will work out pretty seamlessly. And the way this works is you press the analog and up button anytime, and it'll save that state. Then when you want to load it, press the analog button, go into the memory section, and then you'll see save states. Next, you'll have the option to either load or delete, and when you load, it's going to ask, do you really want to do it? And that's essentially it. You'll be able to jump right back into your game. And so at the most rudimentary level, this is kind of like a super upgraded Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. Like I've shown in my previous videos, there are a bunch of different graphical settings that you can adjust to make this dialed into whatever experience you want. And with this form factor in particular, I think that Game Boy and Game Boy Color are just an excellent match for the Analogue Pocket. And you've got multiple ways to enjoy your games. You can either use battery saves or in-game saves to be able to save them like you would on an original console, or of course you can use those memories or save states to be able to save it whenever you would like. So when it comes to an elevated way of enjoying your favorite cartridges, I think this is an excellent way to go, provided you're willing to pay that price. Another thing you could do is just put all of them on a flash card and be able to play them this way as well. But as you may already know if you've watched any of my other videos, I really like unlocking the full potential of any device that I have. And the way you do that is via openFPGA on the Analogue Pocket. And so this is where you can load community cores to be able to play arcade or home console or even handheld systems via SD card. And some of these cores are really incredible, especially some of these arcade ones. They have taken these boards, reversed engineered them, and then allowed them to work on an FPGA. And over the years, we've seen a ton of new games added to the platform. I think we're close to about 150, maybe even 200 at this point. Many of these were ported over from the Mr. console, which is a set-top FPGA board, but it is still really awesome that all of these systems, including the arcade games, have been ported over to a handheld. Now, adding these cores to your Analogue Pocket device used to be a pain in the butt, but it's actually really easy nowadays. Lately, I've been using this one called Pocket Updater, which works only on Windows, but has a nice graphical user interface. And there are apps that work on Mac and Linux as well, but they are going to be command line, so they won't have this nice shiny interface. Either way, I'll leave all the stuff linked down below, but essentially Pocket Updater will allow you to do basically everything all in one. This includes includes downloading the latest Pocket firmware, as well as downloading any sort of core, anything that's available right now. And the setup here is very simple. Just make sure it's pointing to your SD card, and then under Manage Cores, you can choose which games or cores to install. Most of the arcade games will be listed one game at a time, and then you'll also find these systems in there, like NES and Super Nintendo and so on. Also, once you've installed these cores and also added some games to it, you'll be able to organize them however you would like. For example, if you want to change out the name or put it in a different category, you have the option to change that here. Anyway, once you've got all this set up, you just have to click on that update button, and it'll go through all the various repositories and download the cores and then put them on your SD card. And when it comes to the arcade games, they will also download the games themselves because they have been reverse engineered. Now for my part, I've already gone through and done this on my SD card, so there are no updates, but usually this would take a lot longer to go through and download everything. And if you want to uninstall, it's also super simple. Just uncheck it and then run the update again and it'll take it off. Now when it comes to the emulated systems, things like home console, handhelds, and computers, you're going to have to add your own ROM files. It's going to be very similar to any other software emulation program that you might be used to. And the way it works is you'll go into the assets folder that has been created by the app, and within here you'll find folders for all of the corresponding systems that you have installed cores for. From there, just open up the core. For example, we're going to grab Game Boy, and then under there you should find a folder called Common. And all you have to do at that point is just drop in your ROM file and everything else will be taken care of for you. So when it comes to setup, it's actually a pretty seamless experience. You just need that one Pocket Updater app to be able to run and install all the cores and then just drag and drop all of your ROM files. From there, you put the card back into your device, turn it on, and then go into the openFPGA menu. Now, in addition to the individual arcade games that I had already installed, we have what they call Arcade Multi. These are going to be specific boards that had multiple games programmed for them. Probably the most popular examples are going to be the Capcom CPS boards. For example, under CPS 1, you will find games like Final Fight and Ghouls and Ghosts. They've also got CPS 1.5, which is between 1 and 2, and that's going to include some of my favorite games like Cadillacs and Dinosaurs and The Punisher. And then of course we've got CPS 2, probably one of my favorite arcade boards of all time. This is where you're going to find all those classic Street Fighter fighting games and a couple others that are real gems. Anyway, I would recommend checking out some of these boards, like for example with the IREM M92. This one includes some excellent arcade games like Hook and Ninja Baseball Batman, as well as R-Type. And we've also got some Sega boards on here, so if you want to play some old school Shinobi or something like Altered Beast or Golden Axe, they're all here as well. And so I would say between the previous video that I made about the Analogue Pocket and today, the biggest change and upgrade have to do with arcade cores. Some of my all-time favorite arcade games, including Michael Jackson's Moonwalker and Outrun, as well as the Simpsons arcade game and even Ninja Turtles, all are playable on here. In fact, I had a hard time finding arcade games that I wanted to play that weren't available on the Analogue Pocket right now. The only two that I was really missing was the original arcade game for X-Men and then also Mortal Kombat 1. However, I did hear that Mortal Kombat 1 might be coming to the Analogue Pocket here in the future. Regardless, one thing to note about arcade games in particular is that the two main programmers for these cores, they both have beta access programs, and so you have to sign up for their Patreon, you'll get a special zip file, and then you'll be able to put it on your Analogue Pocket. And that will unlock additional cores, and I'm subscribed to one of them, so I'm not really sure if some of these are beta cores or they're the actual releases. Either way, they all eventually leave beta and then they're publicly available. I'm just not really sure right now which one is which. So long story short, the most impressive thing about software development on the Analogue Pocket over the past year or two has been arcade cores, at least for me. However, there are still quite a few other cores that you can play. For example, under computers, we now have Amiga and Commodore 64. In addition, under the home console section, we've had quite a few expanded systems as well. Now, most of the main systems like Sega and Nintendo, those have already been available since my last video, but some of the more obscure systems are now available, and so there's quite a few options here, especially if you want to play something that's a little bit more retro. Now, one thing worth noting, anytime you load up one of these cores, they will have individualized core settings, and it'll change depending on the core that you're playing. So for example, with the Super Nintendo cores, you have the ability to, for example, turbo boost the CPU as well as the Super FX chip. This is going to reduce some of that original slowdown in case you want to play it with a more optimized experience. And with Super Nintendo, you can also adjust the aspect ratio. You can have square pixels or 8:7, or you can have a more standard 4:3, much like with old school CRTs. Now, speaking of CRTs, there are also graphic modes that you can apply to most of these cores. And for the most part, I just use two different ones. The normal one, which will blow it up to full screen, or the CRT Trinitron one. This one will make it a little bit smaller and darker. I think it might be using black frame insertion, which we'll talk about here later. And so it's going to be up to you what kind of effect you want, but when I'm playing in handheld mode, I usually will just keep it in the normal standard style. And that mostly has to do with the large bezels around the screen. I don't want to make them any bigger. Now, one other thing worth noting is most openFPGA cores do not have save states or memories. And so instead, you will have to rely on in-game or battery saves like you did back in the day. And this is probably one of my bigger disappointments with the Analogue Pocket in general. I think it's just a limitation of the hardware because many of these cores just cannot support save states. So if you are going to play something like a Super Nintendo game, just bear in mind that you will have to save the game like you did back in the day directly onto the console. Now, thankfully, there are some cores that do support save states, and that includes NES as well as Sega Master System, as well as all 3 of the Game Boy cores. And so for this reason, I tend to play a lot of NES on my Analogue Pocket just because I can save those save states, which are really convenient. Either way, if you are looking to play up to the 16-bit era, basically up through like Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, as well as even Neo Geo, you can play all of that on the Analogue Pocket. And thanks to the high-resolution display, the overall experience is very crisp. And then finally, of course, we have all of our handheld systems, and there are 17 of these available altogether. Of course, we've got our standard Game Boy systems, but we also have Game Gear as well as Neo Geo Pocket, Atari Lynx, and even WonderSwan Color. And of course, we've got everything in between as well. And honestly, I think that some of these handheld systems are probably a better fit for the Analogue Pocket. After all, this is a handheld device. Now, Game Boy Advance will have larger bezels on the top and bottom because it's a 3x2 system, and so this might bother you, but honestly, once I start playing, I never really notice. And of course, the display looks extra sharp and clear. But I would say the systems that fit the most are going to be those that have a squarish aspect ratio. Game Boy Color, Neo Geo Pocket Color, they all look great. And also bear in mind that most ROM hacks, as long as they're contained within the game ROM itself, will also work. And so that really expands the amount of games that you can play, especially when it comes to all those Pokemon games. Okay, let's move on and talk about accessories. There's a couple that I've picked up and a couple other that I want to comment about. Let's start with the dock. There are 2 different options. One is $99, the other is $130 if you want to get it in white. And even though that price is ridiculously high, it is worth noting that it comes with a USB-C cable, a charging plug, as well as an HDMI cable. And Analogue charges a premium for each of those, so it's nice that at least they are packed in. Now, I am a bit of a cheapskate, and so between the two, having to pay an additional $30 for a white color didn't make a lot of sense for me, so I picked up the black one. And I've been using this for a while, and I have to say that this really elevates the Analogue Pocket, at least for me. The dock itself is super sturdy feeling and a good size, and it's a very simple setup where you could just pop the Analogue Pocket right in. On the back, we've got 2 USB ports, which can be used for controllers, and then we also have HDMI out, as well as the power input in, and then a Bluetooth pairing button. On the front, we've got 4 LED indicators to let you know how many controllers are plugged in. And then finally up top, we have this little cylinder thing, and this essentially is just there to support the device itself. Now, the main thing that really struck me about the Analogue Pocket dock is that when you put the device in, it gives you basically a specific 90-degree angle, so the device does not lean back in any way like you might be used to with most other docks. Either way, I kind of like these angles. It makes it look pretty sharp. And like I mentioned before, it does come with all of the accessories, which I think is a nice touch, especially this little brick with the Analogue logo on it. Now, in addition to being able to connect via Bluetooth, it also supports 2.4 GHz dongles. And I think this is a really smart move to make it a more plug-and-play experience. So for example, if I took this 8-bit DO controller, which is about $30 or $35 and comes with that 2.4 GHz dongle, all I have to do is just plug it directly in, and then everything will work right out of the box. Not only that, when connected with a dongle like this, you can use the controller to turn on the Analogue Pocket, which is a really handy feature. Now, the overall docked experience is almost identical to the handheld experience. It's basically just spitting out the image over into a monitor instead. And so here I am with my GameSir controller. It's about $25 with a 2.4 GHz dongle, and it works great. The user interface itself is a little bit on the ugly side. It almost feels like it was made by an engineer and not a designer. But either way, it's easy enough to go into openFPGA, pick your system, and then boot up your game. Now, one of the things I've noticed when playing home console systems, with NES in particular, I've seen a lot of ghosting behind my character. And so you might be able to see it here. Every time that Mario moves, you can see there's just a shadow that's following him. This was very typical of like handheld systems, for example with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but this is not something you would expect to see on a retro console hooked up to a CRT television. Thankfully, the gameplay experience itself is just fine. There's no like input latency or anything like that. And if the ghosting bothers you like it does for me, then you can reduce it. That CRT display mode that we had talked about previously actually works really well when hooked up to an LCD panel like this. It is going to reduce the size size of the image and also make it a little bit darker. But as you can see here, the LCD ghosting basically disappears. And this does lead me to believe that they are using black frame insertion. So regardless of whatever wizardry is happening in the background, I don't really care, because the biggest thing for me is that it removes the LCD ghosting. It's a shame that it does make the image a little bit smaller, but it is a concession I'm willing to live with. And I think this limitation just has to do with the HDMI signal output, because this is a 4K display, which means that it should scale up a little bit higher. Regardless, I've really been enjoying the docked experience here by playing some of these home console systems with the controller of my choice on a bigger screen. Now, one thing worth noting is that most of these arcade cores will not support an analog stick input, only a D-pad. So even if you are using a controller like this one, which has an analog stick, it's not going to actually register those inputs. And if you go into the core settings and try to map out the controls, you'll find that you cannot map the directional controls, only the buttons. So what this means is if you do want to play arcade cores on the dock hooked up to a television, you're going to have to use the D-pad on your controller. And I think it really depends on the game. I think for many games, including Street Fighter games, I don't mind using a D-pad. But when it comes to a beat-em-up like Final Fight, I totally like to use a stick instead. Now, thankfully, 8BitDo has saved the day. This is their arcade stick, which I've had for almost 4 years at this point. The great thing about this one is that you can change the arcade stick to output to the D-pad inputs. And to top it off, this arcade stick has a 2.4 GHz dongle. And so honestly, even though this is an $80 purchase, I think that this arcade stick is worth its weight in gold when it comes to playing arcade games on the Analogue Pocket. You're going to be able to get all those D-pad inputs with an 8-way arcade stick, and then of course you've got those nice arcade buttons as well. So essentially, this is how I use my Analogue Pocket. If I'm going to be playing something like a handheld system, then I just play it in handheld mode. And then if I'm going to play a home console system, something like Nintendo or Super Nintendo, I will either use it in handheld mode or docked with a controller. And then finally, when it comes to arcade games, I just hook it up with my arcade stick, and this has been a really great time. And after buying the dock, I've been using my Analogue Pocket twice as much as I was before. I've always wanted to dive really deep into the whole MiSTer system, which is that other FPGA console, but I've always been scared off by how complex the whole scene is. And with the Analogue Pocket, we're getting a very similar experience when hooked up to the dock without that larger barrier to entry. So, all things considered, if you are going to get an Analogue Pocket, I would highly encourage you to consider the dock as well, because it has really enhanced my overall experience. Okay, let's move on and talk about a couple of other accessories. We'll start with the case that I've been using for quite some time now. This is from a company called Waterfield out of San Francisco, and it costs $50. It's called their Analogue Pocket Pouch. Now, they have a couple other cases available on their website, but I like this one the best, just because it is so simple, and I like the waxed canvas exterior as well. You've got a single pocket with a little bit of space. Usually I put a microfiber cloth in here, and that's basically it. Now, Analogue themselves also offer a special case. This is their acrylic case, and this costs $30. Now, this I would consider to be more of a display case than an actual container. And the nice thing about this is that it has been perfectly engineered for the Analogue Pocket itself. For example, on the back, they've got these little rubber studs, which will go directly into these screw holes. And as a result, your Analogue Pocket just kind of floats within the case, and it's a pretty cool thing to see. However, I'm a little bit torn about this entire case just from a philosophical standpoint. Anytime I put it inside of this acrylic case, I want to put it up on a shelf and just never play it and just kind of look at it. It looks pretty cool. But I also think that the purpose of a handheld is to actually play it, and so it is kind of a pain to take it in and out of this case. But I guess at some point, if you ever think of retiring your Analogue Pocket, this is going to be a great accompaniment to that. And let's face it, this thing is beautiful enough to display on a shelf. Now, if you wanted to make it even more beautiful, then one place I would recommend going is Sakura Retro Modding. This has been one of my favorite Etsy shops over the years, and these guys just dived in, feet first, directly into the Analogue Pocket. In fact, they have nearly 40 different customization options available for your machine. And that includes stickers and decals like you might expect, but then also full button swaps as well. And so if you are looking to personalize your FPGA handheld, then this is a place that I would definitely recommend checking out. And I've bought a few things from them for my Analogue Pocket over the years, but the main thing that just kind of stayed on my device has been this holographic sticker on the back. It's getting a little beat up just after all the use I've given this handheld, but overall I like the little pop of holographic color on the back of a very clean device. Either way, I'm going to leave links to all these accessories in the video description below. Okay, so I think that's really going to be about it when it comes to my assessment of the Analogue Pocket in terms of things that have updated since previously, and then just my overall feelings of the device. So let's go ahead and summarize and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the overall Analogue Pocket experience. As always, we're going to start with what I like the most. Number Number one, this thing feels like a premium Game Boy. It's almost like a Game Boy made for adults. Even though it's been about 4 or 5 years since the Analogue Pocket was first announced, they really did a great job because this is a timeless design. And every time I pick up this handheld, I am always reminded of how high quality it is, and that isn't very often with a lot of these other handhelds on the market. I also love this really high resolution screen. The fact that we have 1440 vertical pixels means that scaling is going to look really good. I also really appreciate how much openFPGA has expanded over the past couple years. In particular, when it comes to arcade cores, we are seeing new developments every month. Another thing that's relatively new to me is the overall docked experience of the Analogue Pocket. In my previous videos, I didn't have that dock. And like I mentioned, it really has doubled the amount of time that I've spent with the Analogue Pocket because I love hooking it up to a TV and playing on there. Obviously, there are plenty of other devices that can do that, but this is such a plug-and-play experience that I often prefer it. And finally, the other nice thing about the Analogue Pocket is that it's actually in stock and available for purchase. For many years, there was a waiting list, and it took forever to fulfill all the orders. And even then, there have been periods where you just couldn't order one, even on standby. So it is nice to see that you can just go to the website right now, pick up a device, and then only spend about $30 on shipping, which I think is reasonable compared to what it used to be. So overall, I would say I have come to appreciate the Analogue Pocket more and more over the years. However, it's not a perfect device, and even though I have basically gotten used to some of its flaws, there are two that keep coming back for me. The first is the overall user experience. It is all text-based and a little bit cumbersome and rudimentary. Like I mentioned previously, it feels like the overall experience was made by an engineer but not a designer. And I'd love to see an upgraded experience. It doesn't have to be graphical, but maybe just a little bit better of a font or more intuitive of a layout. Thankfully, I would say that's a relatively minor con, all things considered, since you're going to be spending most of your time in a game and not in the menu. And then finally, another thing that I just can't let slide by is the fact that this is a very expensive setup. And it's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario. When I first just had the Analogue Pocket, I wasn't a huge fan of it. But then later on, once openFPGA came around and we had additional systems, then yes, I did like it a lot more. However, I really didn't start to love the device until I got the dock. And even then, to get the full dock experience, then I would also recommend that arcade stick, which costs an additional $80. So if you're doing the math in your head, you're looking at around $500 for this whole setup of having the Analogue Pocket and then a dock, and then also the controller and arcade stick, and then of course shipping and taxes. And so it is a little bit crazy that in order to get the most out of the Analogue Pocket, you have to get the additional accessories, and those are going to put you back quite a bit. And so it all kind of leads down to the same path for me, and that the Analogue Pocket is of value even at $500. After all, there's no other FPGA handheld that will be able to play a bunch of cartridge-based systems, but then also be able to play arcade games and home consoles via openFPGA. If I was to buy an Analogue Pocket today with all the fixins, I think it's just a little bit outside of my own price point. But thankfully I did make it a little bit easier on myself over the years by buying all of these things piecemeal and then kind of putting it together over time. Because at the end of the day, I love my final Analogue Pocket experience, being able to play it in handheld mode, but then also being able to dock it, and with my arcade stick, all that together is a really great experience. But it does make me blush a little bit when I think about how much I paid for this overall setup. And so this console is in a unique space where it is a lot of fun for me to use, but not one that I would readily recommend. If you are looking to dip your toes into the whole retro gaming thing, then I would recommend a software emulator experience as opposed to this. And I think right now, probably the best approximation that I could say would be the Analogue RG40XXV. This handheld came out about a month ago. I did a full review about it. I'll leave it linked down below. This guy costs somewhere around $70, but is a software emulation machine. Honestly, it kind of looks a bit like an Analogue Pocket you can see with the all-white version that I have here, and it does have some pretty great features, including Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and even HDMI out. In addition, for the price point, this one has an impressive amount of power. Not only can it play all of the systems that we were just showing off on the Analogue Pocket, but quite a bit more. It's not going to be able to play all of them at 100% speed, but quite a few Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and PSP games will run pretty well on here. And of course, those classic systems will play great, and we have a number of different custom firmware options as well. And so you can really change the overall look and feel of the user experience, which I think is one of my favorite aspects of this device. It also has an analog stick in case you need it, which I think comes in handy, especially when it comes to arcade games. Now the display here is 4 inches with only a 480p resolution, but a 4:3 aspect ratio and very thin bezels. When it comes to playing more squarish systems, things like Game Boy or Game Boy Color, it doesn't really hold a candle to the Analogue Pocket. Even when using a combination of shaders and overlays to try to achieve a similar effect, you can definitely see that this is a cheaper version compared to the other. But where the device really shines is 4x3 content, for example here with Sega Genesis. Not only does it fill out the whole screen and have those tiny little bezels, but the image itself is just quite a bit bigger as well. And so hands down, when it comes to 4x3 systems, including things like Super Nintendo and Genesis and even arcade games, I'd rather play them on the RG40XXV. And in the end, I really don't like comparing these two because one's a hardware emulation machine and the other one is doing software emulation, and so they're kind of peas and carrots. But when it comes down to the end result, which is going to be the overall user experience of navigating through and enjoying just the overall look and feel, then I do find that the RG40XXV at $70 is a really strong contender against something that is quite a bit more, even if it is better. And bear in mind that there are a lot of perks with software emulation, the ability to be able to use save states with any of the different cores, and you've got a much greater amount of customization to include things like shaders and overlays, but then also you can freely map your hotkeys and use cheats and even rewind with some emulators. Plus, because it's a Wi-Fi enabled system, that means you'll be able to use retro achievements, and so if you're into that, you'll be able to use it with this device as well. So I realize I'm being contradictory here by saying that yes, the Analogue Pocket is worth it at its high price point, but then also the RG40XXV is an easier recommendation. And it all comes down to that price point and barrier to entry, and I think that the Amernic device is excellent in its own way. And I also think that the Analogue Pocket is excellent for those who know what they're getting into and will appreciate it. Now, if you are looking to just play Game Boy and Game Boy Color, another device that I would recommend checking out is going to be this one. This is the Funny Playing FPGB-C. And this one is also an FPGA, but a lot cheaper, and that's because it only runs 2 cores, Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And I made a whole video about this one, and I will also leave it linked down below. But the main point here is that you can customize this device however you would like. And it's basically using an aftermarket Game Boy Color shell that has been modified to be able to use with this specific screen and this board. And you've got a ton of different customization options, including the shell and the colors, and so you can really make it your own. And it's a lot cheaper. It's about $85 after shipping, but bear in mind you'll have to assemble it yourself. Either way, if you're just looking to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, the Analogue Pocket obviously will be a superior experience, but for $85 this is not half bad either. And with that, I think that's about it for this video. I wanted to show off everything that's been updated with the Analogue Pocket over the past couple years, and I also wanted to show why I love this machine so much, but then also some other recommendations that might be a better fit for you. When it comes down to it, I really enjoy my Analogue Pocket, and I just try not to think about how much I paid for this experience. And in case you're wondering, now that I have 2, I've been planning on getting rid of 1, and I'm still kind of undecided about which one I'm going to keep. But at least for now, after spending a few days making this video for the limited edition Analogue Pocket, I think this is going to be the one that I choose. I'm going to sleep on it for about a week, but yeah, I think the yellow one is the way to go. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have you picked up an Analogue Pocket? Have you been considering it? Or do you think that software emulators are the way to go instead? I can definitely see both sides, but I'd love to hear your take as well. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.